Thank you so much, Jessica, and thanks to everybody who helped organize this event. I think it's wonderful to have the opportunity to engage in these conversations about such important issues like the issue of abortion, which is of course especially salient with the upcoming Supreme Court case that may very well overturn Roe versus Wade. So the focus of my talk will be not on legal aspects of the abortion debate, though I'd be happy to discuss any questions that people might have about that in the Q&A, but my focus instead will be on the ethics of abortion, and in particular addressing what in my many years of kind of research and teaching on this issue, I have discovered to be kind of typical misconceptions that people have about the ethics of abortion, as well as many challenges related to the ethics of abortion. So basically the way the talk will work is I'll run through a number of these misconceptions or misunderstandings, clarify those misconceptions, and then run through some of those challenges and how we might respond to those challenges. So first of all, one typical misconception in the abortion debate is the idea that we don't know when life begins. This misconception is highlighted directly in the Roe versus Wade Supreme Court decision, legalizing abortion in all 50 states. In Roe, the majority opinion stated, "We need not resolve the difficult question of when life begins, when those trained in the respective disciplines of medicine, philosophy, and theology are unable to arrive at any consensus. The judiciary at this point in the development of man's knowledge is not in a position to speculate as to the answer." Early in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which is the Supreme Court case that effectively reaffirmed Roe versus Wade, maintaining the legality of abortion. The justices wrote, "At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life." Again, giving the impression that when life begins, or what counts as a human life, is a mystery that we cannot answer with science, or that we simply are not aware of the answer to. But neither of these opinions reflects the current state of the science, and even the state of the science at the time of Roe versus Wade in 1973. It was very clear then, and is even clearer now, that life begins at fertilization, more precisely in the moment when sperm and egg fuse. That's the moment when an entirely new trajectory of biological development begins, and that is the beginning of the new life of each one of us. And there's very clear scientific consensus on this in numerous standard biology and embryology textbooks, as well as scholarly articles in the sciences. And here's just one example of many, many, many examples that I could give that state this very clearly from a biological perspective. Human life begins at fertilization, the process during which a male gamete or sperm unites with a female gamete or oocyte to form a single cell called a zygote. This highly specialized totipotent cell marked the beginning of each of us as a unique individual. A zygote is the beginning of a new human being. So again, the science here is very, very clear, and we could go into the reasons why we know that this is the moment when a new human life begins, but I'll sort of leave that to the Q&A if people want more details on that. I know there was a previous webinar that delved more deeply into the science. Now, a second misconception that's somewhat related to the first is that abortion is fundamentally about a woman's right to do what she wants with her own body. And this is reflected, of course, in much of the popular rhetoric surrounding the abortion rights movement, rhetoric about, my body, my choice, a woman's right to choose. Even the label pro-choice relates to the idea that a woman has a right to choose what she wants to do with her own body. The response to this misconception is that the unborn child is a distinct human being, not part of the woman's body. And of course, while we do have the right to use our body as we like, that right is limited by the rights of other people, right? Colloquially, right, my right to swing my fist ends where your nose begins. I can't swing my arms around and use my body in ways that harm other people. But with regard to abortion, that's exactly what's going on. Although the unborn child is inside the woman's body, the child is a distinct human being, not a part of the woman's body. Some of the scientific evidence that indicates that is, first of all, that the unborn child has a unique genetic code, different from the mother or the father. The unborn child directs his or her own development. So the instructions for the development of that life come not from the mother, but come from that child's own unique genetic code that directs the development and unfolding of the life of that child, which began at conception. What the mother's body provides only nutrition, protection, and a safe environment. That, of course, is important. But nutrition, protection, and a safe environment are things that we all need throughout our lives. It just so happens that in the first 9 months of our life, the appropriate environment, the environment that we need to get the nutrition that we need and the protection that we need, is our mother's womb. Now, a third misconception is that even though we know that human life biologically begins at conception and that the unborn child is a human being biologically, many proponents of abortion will say, still, the fact that it's a biological human life isn't really what gives that life moral rights or the right to life. Instead, they'll say that the kind of thing that has rights is what philosophically or legally we call a person. The unborn child, they argue, is not a person because the unborn child doesn't manifest the characteristics that are typical of persons, like being able to think, make free choices, and feel things, right? The unborn child still has those capacities in root form, but hasn't fully developed those capacities yet, and so can't manifest them. This is reflected again in the Roe versus Wade decision, where the justice noted that the word person, as used in the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which talks about the rights that we all have to equal protection under the law, such that our life, liberty, or property cannot be taken away from us without due process of law. That word person in the Constitution, the justices claim, does not include the unborn. From a philosophical perspective, you have many philosophers who defend abortion, like Marianne Warren, quoted here, as well as Peter Singer at Princeton, Jeff McMahon at Oxford, and many others, who likewise recognize that the unborn child is fully human, but argue that it's not a person. It doesn't yet have moral rights because it lacks the characteristics that are the basis for moral rights. And here's a quote from Marianne Warren, who says, genetic humanity is neither necessary nor sufficient for establishing that an entity is a person. A fetus is a human being which is not yet a person, and which therefore cannot coherently be said to have full moral rights. So how do we respond to this? Well, the response to this is to recognize that all human beings are persons with equal fundamental dignity rights. And it's very important to note that if the unborn are persons because they lack the ability to manifest the qualities that are typical of persons, like the ability to reason, to use language, and so on, well, then neither are infants. Infants are also unable to manifest rational capacities. They can't speak. They don't have a highly developed sense of self or self-awareness. The same with those who have very severe cognitive disabilities. And philosophers like Marianne Warren, Peter Singer, Jeff McMahon, those same philosophers who argue in favor of abortion, on the grounds that the unborn are not persons, likewise argue that for the same reason, morally speaking, there is nothing wrong with infanticide or with the killing of those with severe cognitive disabilities. In fact, they think in some cases that such killing would be a benefit to the person involved because their quality of life is so low. So on their view, right, people like Sisha here, who is the daughter of a feminist philosopher who I've enjoyed the opportunity to engage in a number of conversations with, Eva Fader-Kate. People like Sisha, who has effectively 0 IQ, according to the doctors, would also be considered non-persons and also lack a right to life for the same reasons that the unborn are considered to be not persons. Now, why do I believe that all human beings, regardless of their state of development, regardless of their cognitive capacities, that all human beings are nonetheless persons with equal dignity and rights? I believe that that's the case because all human beings possess a rational nature. In other words, all of us, simply because we're human, possess that basic natural capacity for rationality, even though we can't all manifest that capacity because there might be some physical defect, for instance, something that's going wrong in the brain or an immaturity in brain development that blocks that person's ability to use their rational capacities, to manifest their rational capacities, just as would be the case with a person in a coma. While they're in a coma, they're not able to manifest their rational capacities, but nonetheless, those capacities are there in root form, just as they are in the unborn or in those with severe cognitive disabilities. And this picture here is actually a beautiful service that will take ultrasound photos of your unborn child and then do afterbirth photos and pair them with the ultrasound photos. So what you're seeing here is the same child before birth in the mother's and then after birth. And this again is just a powerful manifestation of the fact that if we say that this child before birth is not a person and therefore does not have a right to life, well, what's the difference between this child before birth and after birth? It's clearly the same human being, and the level of their capacities is not strikingly different, right? Neither has the immediately exercisable capacity to reason, to use language, or to engage in any of the things that philosophers like Marianne Warren consider to be the hallmarks of person. So if it's not wrong to kill this child before birth, there's no reason why it wouldn't be wrong to kill this child after birth. Again, as these pro-choice philosophers would readily admit. Further, it's worth noting that the claim that some humans are not persons, therefore lack full moral rights, has been used to justify slavery, genocide, and countless other atrocities throughout human history. What you see here pictured on the screen is a typical version of the science, or the pseudoscience really, of phrenology, studying of different human skulls. And this pseudoscience was used in order to attempt to justify slavery by claiming that the size and shape of the skulls of Blacks are closer to those of apes than to those of whites, who are seen to be the more fully evolved and therefore fully human members of the species. And even people as beloved and intelligent and generally committed to human freedom as Thomas Jefferson bought into this kind of pseudoscience. Jefferson wrote, comparing them, Blacks, by their faculties of memory, reason, and imagination, it appears to me that in memory, they are equal to the whites, in reason, much inferior, and that in imagination they are dull, tasteless, and anomalous. Right? Again, looking at the capacities that Jefferson witnessed in his slaves, presumably, and saying, well, they seem to be inferior in capacity by contrast with whites, and therefore he used that as a justification for maintaining the enslavement of these people, right? Again, this is a challenge to any who would say, well, sure, the unborn are human, but they're not persons. They're not like you and I. They don't have the same kind of rights because they don't have the same kind of capacities. Well, that same line of thinking, again, has been used to justify terrible things throughout history. And the logic is precisely the same for the unborn as it was for justifications of racism, slavery, and terrible things that now, thankfully, we have discovered are wrong. Now, a fourth type of misconception in the abortion debate is the idea that abortion is healthcare and that therefore it's a private matter between a woman and her doctor that ought to be decided without any government interference. The trouble with this view is that pregnancy is not a disease. And if you think abortion is healthcare, well, then you have to ask, what is abortion curing? Well, it's curing pregnancy, but pregnancy is not a disease or doesn't need to be cured. The idea that abortion is healthcare actually promotes the false notion that pregnancy is a disease. But women's bodies are designed to be able to gestate offspring. The ability to conceive and gestate a child is a sign of health, not a sign of illness. On the contrary, the inability to conceive or to sustain a pregnancy is a sign that the woman's body is not functioning properly. And the fact that pregnancy has been treated as a disease in our law and in the design of healthcare has actually arguably seriously undermined the ability of women to get proper healthcare related to pregnancy and fertility. Because so much effort has been put into preventing or ending pregnancy that little study has been done about the actual proper functioning of the woman's reproductive system and how to optimize her reproductive system for her fertility and as a matter of overall health. And a number of doctors who are concerned about this have started to write about it. And one example is this book here, talking about pregnancy as the fifth vital sign, that for women, healthy functioning of the menstrual cycle is a crucial sign regarding a woman's overall health. And many doctors know extremely little actually about the delicate dance and interplay of the hormones in the woman's reproductive cycle and about how to study that delicate interplay in order to optimize a woman's overall health, in addition to addressing the root causes of infertility. And inattention to that is partially due, again, to the fact that we have been treating pregnancy as a disease rather than recognizing fertility as a healthy aspect of a woman's biology. Second, the vast majority of abortions are what we call elective, meaning that there is no medical reason for them. And here in these charts, you see data both from Florida in 2018, where Florida a number of years ago began collecting data systematically, asking every woman after an abortion what the reason was, and went into the doctor's charts and then was reported to the state. So here from 2018, of 70,000 abortions, you see the various reasons. Note that things like a woman's life being endangered by the pregnancy is, 0.25%, right? So extremely rare. Likewise, any physical health reason, even non-life endangering physical health concerns, were still only 1.5%, very rare. Psychological health, which is a sort of dubious category because, as we'll see soon, psychological health is threatened by abortion as well. But psychological health, even that was a very small percentage. The vast majority fell under, sort of purely elective, which could just be doesn't want another child, or doesn't want this particular child. It could include even things like sex selection abortion, or selective abortion because the child is diagnosed prenatally syndrome, for instance, or social or economic reasons, which of course are not medical reasons, and many of those reasons could be resolved with adoption if a woman feels not socially or economically able to raise a child. So again, no, not a medical reason why this pregnancy was any danger to the woman in itself. If you look at the Guttmacher Institute's data, this is Planned Parenthood's research arm, basically you find a sort of similar set of responses where, if you add all of the various reasons that have nothing to do with health, you come up with a similar, very, very large percentage of the abortions are elective. And even in 1967, Dr. Alan Guttmacher, an abortionist and involved with Planned Parenthood, said that today it is possible for almost any patient to be brought through pregnancy alive unless she suffers from a fatal illness such as cancer or leukemia, and if so, abortion would be unlikely to prolong, much less save life. And like I said, that was in 1967. Our technology has gotten even better now, such that there would be even fewer cases in which the life of the mother would genuinely be at stake. And in those cases, we'll talk about that in a bit more detail later on, but in cases where the life of the mother is genuinely at stake, nobody thinks that a woman has to literally sacrifice her in order to bring a pregnancy to term. Those are her life, even if as an unwanted side effect of that, the unborn child will die. But we'll talk about the difference there a little bit later on. So a fourth, or the next misconception, is that abortion is necessary for women's equality. And one of the famous proponents of this view is Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who wrote that the decision whether or not to bear a child is central to a woman's life, to her well-being and dignity. It is a decision that she must make for herself. When the government controls that decision for her, she is being treated as less than a full adult human, responsible for her own choices. Now, we can respond to this concern by recognizing that true equality would involve respect and support for women's unique capacity to bear children, instead of requiring women effectively to become like men, to suppress their fertility and do violence to their bodies and children in order to be able to compete socially and economically. And that's why all of the early feminists, those who were fighting for women's suffrage and equal rights of women within marriage and so on, they were all against abortion because they all thought that the same failure to respect the full personhood, the equal rights of women, was just as wrong when it would be applied to an unborn child. And they also thought of abortion as a violence to women that women would only be driven to because there was a lack of support from the father of the child or from the broader society. And that's why Alice Paul, an early feminist, wrote that abortion is the ultimate exploitation of women. And indeed, even Ruth Bader Ginsburg herself, when speaking on other matters, recognizes that women will only have true equality when men share with them the responsibility of bringing up the next generation. And the problem is that with legal abortion, the onus, the burden, gets placed entirely on the woman, because since the woman is the one who can make the choice to have an abortion, it leaves men with the excuse to say, well, if you choose to have this child, then it's up to you to raise the child. Whereas, if you don't want to have the child, if you don't want the responsibility of having the child, well, then you can have the abortion. So it throws that terrible, agonizing decision onto the woman instead of calling men to take up the responsibility to support the children that they fathered, and calling on society to help women in need, ensuring that they have the resources to be able to at least carry their pregnancies to term with proper medical care, if not actually raise that child themselves. The next misconception is the idea that abortion is a simple solution. And when faced with an unplanned pregnancy, there's obviously a natural feeling of distress that many women have when they're just not ready to have a child, when thinking about it, when it's come at the wrong time. And abortion is very often presented to women by many people, by friends, by family, by boyfriends, husbands, and by various counselors, including by abortion clinics, as the simple solution that will just make them unpregnant and solve their problem as if the pregnancy had never happened. But there is no simple solution to an unplanned pregnancy. And abortion regret is a very real thing. Here's a quote from a young woman who experienced this for herself, Mary. She wrote, "I once thought an unwanted pregnancy could easily be fixed, but it wasn't until I carried the weight of the decision, quite literally in my body, that I realized this was far from easy or fixable. I knew that choosing to keep the baby would be a remarkably challenging endeavor. But even with the assistance of an abortion clinic to make it all stop, I knew too vividly how that choice would affect the rest of my life as well." And this view that Lindsay is talking about is borne out in the experience of the thousands of women who suffer from post-abortion trauma, a trauma which in some ways is all the more difficult because society tells them that they have nothing to be traumatized about. And here is a quote from Kevin Burke and Janet Marana, co-founders of ministries to women suffering from post-abortion trauma, who have worked with and heard the stories of countless women. And on the basis of their work, they've come to understand some of the sources of this post-abortion trauma. They write that for a woman to consider abortion her best option, she must reject any intuitive sense that she is already a mother to her child. This denial, whether conscious or unconscious, is the beginning of a powerful conflict between the natural love of a parent for her developing child and a pressing need to repress this truth of the human heart, burying any painful feelings and memories of the abortion. The enduring consequences of this internal conflict can contribute to the common symptoms experienced after abortion, such as depression, anxiety, addiction, and sleep disturbance. So these very real psychological problems that women face for years and years after their abortions are things that abortion supporters don't want to talk about. And they present abortion as a simple and easy solution, but a woman knows that there was a child that she had inside of her that existed and that now no longer exists because of her choice. And living with that knowledge is easy. Now, the last misconception that I want to address is that abortion is a religious issue, and therefore that as a policy matter, we ought not to impose our religious beliefs about the wrongness of abortion onto everybody else who might not share them. But this is clearly a false. Abortion is not a religious issue any more than racial justice, immigration reform, environmental protection, poverty relief, or basically any other social issue. Abortion is a human rights issue. And if we were to dismiss abortion as a religious issue, we'd also have to dismiss cries for racial justice as religious, given that they were largely put forth by religious leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. who was explicitly religious in his call for equal treatment of Blacks and whites, recognizing that we are all God's children, we are all made in the image and likeness of God, that we are all equal. And even the Declaration of Independence, right, refers to the fact that we are all equal, endowed with inalienable rights by our Creator, right? So these are not fundamentally religious claims, really. They're fundamentally claims about universal human rights, the most basic of human rights, particularly the right to life, the right not to be intentionally killed by another person. Now let's think about a few of the challenges to the pro-life cause. So the first challenge that often comes up in discussions about abortion is, well, what about back alley abortions? If abortion is restricted or even entirely outlawed, aren't we just going to end up with thousands of women who resort to back alley abortions and end up being harmed in the process? And the response to this is that, in fact, it's a made up problem based on false statistics. Quote from Dr. Bernard Nathanson, one of the co-founders of the National Abortion Rights Action League, who later, after himself performed thousands of abortions, who later, as a result of ultrasound technology, came face to face with the humanity of the unborn child and had a conversion of heart and became pro-life. But he admits that we as founders spoke of 5,000 to 10,000 deaths a year from illegal back alley abortions. I confess that I knew the figures were totally false. It was a useful figure, widely accepted, so why go out of our way to correct it with honest statistics? And another version of this response is to note that abortion-related mortality and maternal mortality more generally has declined due to the discovery of penicillin and to improvements in medical techniques, not due to the legalization of abortion. And if you look here at maternal deaths attributable to abortion in the US, the numbers from 1942 to 1984, what you basically see is that after the discovery of penicillin, the death rates decline rapidly until they start to stabilize somewhere around 30, right? And that the rates do not go down significantly after the legalization of abortion. So what was going on here was that there were fewer deaths attributable to abortion, fewer maternal deaths. Obviously, there's always the death of a child in an abortion, but there were fewer maternal deaths because of improved medical technique, not because abortion was legal. And if you see this also in comparisons to Europe, so if you look at Sweden in the 40s and Denmark in the 40s, where abortion was legal, right? You see death rates of 250 or 195 per 100,000 versus the US, where it was illegal from 1940 to 1950, the death rate was actually lower, right? So again, the differences here were in developments of safer techniques, not in legalization. And in fact, the current legal regime regarding abortion has led to a fundamentally lack of regulation in the US regarding abortion clinics. In some states, abortion clinics are subject to fewer regulations than veterinary clinics because the pro-abortion lobby fights against even minimal reasonable health regulations on abortion clinics, arguing that they are a burden on women's abortion access. And so because of these lack of regulations, unscrupulous abortionists continue to use unsafe methods. In other words, this kind of back alley methods are effectively still being used, even though abortion is legal. Not in all clinics, of course, but in some, due to lack of regulation and all of the publicity around the trial of Kermit Gosnell, a Philadelphia abortionist a number of years ago, was just one particularly egregious example of this. But just to get a few numbers in this regard. 227 abortion providers in 32 states were cited for more than 1,400 health and safety deficiencies between 2008 and 2016. So again, legalization has not actually made abortion safer. And more broadly, legalization of abortion does not lower overall maternal mortality, that is associated with pregnancy and birth. And here are some comparative studies of various countries are very telling. So there was a study regarding the case of Chile in 2012, where they compared the maternal mortality ratio when abortion was legal in Chile from 1959 to 1989. And at that point, the maternal mortality rate was 41.3 deaths per 1,000 live births. Chile made abortion illegal in 1989. And you see that the period when abortion was legal, from 1989 to 2007, you actually had significantly lower maternal mortality, 12.7 deaths per 100,000 versus 41.3 when abortion was legal. Similarly, you can compare Ireland prior to Ireland's legalization of abortion and England and Scotland, where abortion was legalized in 1968. So the maternal mortality rate in Ireland when abortion was illegal from 1968 to 2011 was only 1 to 2 per 100,000. By comparison with England and Scotland, where the maternal mortality rate was 10 to 12 per 100,000. So clearly, having legal abortion is not contributing to overall maternal mortality. And perhaps having legal abortion may, in various direct and indirect ways, may actually be leading to increases in maternal mortality, in part because abortion itself is risky, and in part because abortion can lead to an increased risk of future ectopic pregnancies, which are some of the highest risk pregnancies for women. So a second challenge to the pro-life cause is the question, well, what about fetal deformity or illness, particularly very, very serious cases where you have a diagnosis of a severe and fatal condition of an unborn child prior to birth? Now, what's the point of continuing such a pregnancy to term when you know that the child is not going to live very long, perhaps, or is just going to have a life full of suffering? And the response here is that sick and disabled children have the same right to life as the rest of us. After all, if it's not okay to kill sick, disabled, or terminally ill children after birth, why is it okay to kill them before birth? Further, it's important to recognize that prenatal diagnoses are not always correct. It's not that uncommon that a woman is told that her child is going to have a serious disability or a life-threatening illness prenatally, and then the woman gives birth and the child is quite healthy, or the diagnosis was wrong, and that the child, while sick, has a much better prognosis than what the doctors had really thought. For unborn children expected to die soon after death, there is a growing perinatal hospice movement, which ensures the child's comfort and provides support for parents by preparing everything so that once the baby is delivered, there's a kind of expert comfort care team there to ensure that the baby has everything that he or she needs not to suffer during his or her short life, and then that there's plenty of support for parents, and ensuring that the short time that those parents have with their child is a positive experience of love and bonding, and that then they can properly mourn the loss of that child after he or she dies. And here are just a couple of quotes from women who chose perinatal hospice for children diagnosed with a terminally ill disease prenatally. So James, my entire family wanted me to terminate. I still can't bring myself to write abort. They thought it would be easier on me. In the end, everyone was so glad I decided to continue. We all fell in love with her. And another woman that says, I really have peace that we carried her to term. I know in my heart that I've given my daughter all that I could and loved her every day of her life. So of course, Having a sick or terminally ill child is a terrible tragedy, but ending that life prematurely through abortion doesn't make that tragedy any better. In fact, it then often leaves parents with the further trauma of feeling guilty because they have ended the life of their child themselves, rather than allowing it to take its course. Finally, perhaps the most difficult challenge for the pro-life cause is the concern about rape, right? How can we possibly ask a woman who has suffered a terrible trauma of sexual assault to carry that child to term when that child was conceived through the act of rape? And the response to that is that, of course, while there's no easy solution to this, just as there's no easy solution to any unwanted pregnancy, abortion doesn't undo the rape. It doesn't undo the trauma of the rape. It merely adds another trauma on top of the trauma of the rape. Abortion itself is psychologically traumatic for many women, and as I mentioned before, is associated with many long-term mental health problems. And many rape victims themselves have experienced this after deciding to abort as a result of becoming pregnant due to rape, and being counseled that this would be the solution or a simple quick fix. They discovered that it was not. So here's one testimony of many that I could cite of Pat, a pseudonym for a rape victim abortion survivor. Pat wrote, "Fear and pain caused me to cry during the procedure. It was nearly as humiliating as the rape itself. In my experience, abortion only compounded the trauma and pain I was already experiencing. A criminal may have fathered the child, but I was the mother, and I killed a part of myself when I had the abortion. I would definitely discourage a woman from having an abortion. While it may seem to be the quickest and easiest solution to a painful, humiliating problem, it's a band-aid approach with horrible ramifications of its own. For me, the effects of abortion are much more far-reaching than the effects of the rape in my life." And of other cases here, one of Edith Young, a 12-year-old victim of incest, impregnated by her stepfather, who writes 25 years after the abortion of her child, "Throughout the years, I've been depressed, suicidal, furious, outraged, lonely, and have felt a sense of loss. The abortion, which was to be in my best interest, just has not been. As far as I can tell, it only saved their reputations, solved their problems, and allowed their lives to go merrily on. My daughter, how I miss her so. I miss her regardless of the reason for her conception." And then a example, a woman who writes, "I, having lived through rape and also having raised a child conceived in rape, feel personally assaulted and insulted every time I hear that abortion should be legal because of rape and incest. I feel that we're being used by pro-abortionists to further the abortion issue, even though we've not been asked to tell our side." And indeed, studies have shown that the vast majority of women who conceive due to rape actually don't want to abort, and that many who do end up aborting do so because they feel pressured into doing so. And then finally, it's important to note that even children conceived in rape are beings who have a right to life, and it's not their fault for having been conceived through this violent action. And here, Rebecca Kiesling, one of these people conceived through rape. Rebecca writes, "Please understand that whenever you identify yourself as pro-choice, or whenever you make that exception for rape, what that really translates into is you being able to stand before me, look me in the eyes, and say to me, 'I think your mother should have been able to abort you.' That's a pretty powerful statement. I would never say anything like that to someone. I would never say to someone, 'If I had my way, you'd be dead right now.' But that is the reality with which I live. I challenge anyone to describe for me how it's not." And then I'm going to wrap up here very quickly, just talk about the challenge of abortion when the mother's life is at stake. And as I mentioned before, these cases are not truly abortion in the ethical or moral sense, because they don't involve the intentional killing of the unborn child, whereas abortion, properly defined, involves the intentional killing of the unborn child. So procedures that are necessary to save the mother's life are morally acceptable, even if the unborn child may die as a side effect. For instance, procedures necessary to end an ectopic pregnancy, which could be life-threatening to the woman, or a pregnant woman with uterine cancer who may need to have her uterus removed and undergo chemotherapy, which of course will result in the death of the unborn child. In all of those cases, the death of the unborn child is not what's intended. It's much regretted as a side effect of a procedure that's needed to save the life of the child. Now, some women, for instance, with cancer, may heroically decide that they will risk their lives and delay getting the needed medical treatment to save their own lives in order to be able to carry their pregnancies to term and attempt to save the life of their child. That's a morally heroic response, but it's not more required. One can choose to save the mother and accept as a much regretted side effect that the unborn child may die as a result, but that's not intentional killing and therefore abortion, properly speaking. So I have a few kind of counter challenges here that I won't go into. I'll just run past the slides, and then if anybody wants to ask about them, we can do that, because I do want to leave a few minutes for question and answers. So first counter challenge is, what about abortion for convenience? Most people think that there are some scenarios where, we shouldn't abort for pure convenience. But if we shouldn't abort for pure convenience, that's effectively a recognition that abortion kills a human being. And if it does that, well, why is it wrong to kill a human being for any other reason either? Also, what about sex selection abortion? If we feel uncomfortable with abortion on the basis of a parent's not wanting a girl, for instance, something that's not so common in the US, though it does happen, but very common in other places. Well, if it's not right to choose to abort because parents don't want a girl, well, why is it right to abort because parents don't want a child? Still, again, wrong for essentially the same reasons. And then lastly, the connection between abortion and eugenics, which is at the origins historically of Planned Parenthood. Margaret Sanger infamously said, we want to exterminate the Negro population, and still that connection continues to exist. We see that abortion rates for Black women are 5 times higher than for white women, and that half of African-American pregnancies end in abortion. In some big cities, more than half end in abortion. And that 90% of Planned Parenthood clinics are in or near minority communities, though they have disavowed that historical legacy of eugenics. Nonetheless, their current practice still plays into this eugenic aspect of abortion, which again should be troubling for any of us who care about racial justice. So I will stop there. Apologize for going on for so long, and open it up to questions.
Melissa, thank you so much for that fantastic presentation, both of sort of the challenges, our common misconceptions regarding abortion, and then also some of these more difficult issues that are tied into questions around abortion. We do have a few questions. Our first question is, you said that one of the misconceptions is that abortion is a religious issue. This person would like you to speak a little bit more about the role of law in moral formation and informing the culture, given that abortion is not simply a religious issue.
Right. So, I mean, abortion, as I said, I mean, if abortion is a religious issue, well, so is murder, right? The Catholic faith teaches that murder is wrong, but that doesn't mean that laws against murder are based on religion in some illegitimate way. In fact, the reason why the Catholic Church is opposed to abortion is the same reason why the Catholic Church is opposed to murder. In other words, that the Church teaches that every human life has equal fundamental dignity and deserves respect. And the most bare bones level of respect that you can give to somebody is to refrain from killing them. Now, law obviously plays a really important role in not just permitting or prohibiting certain things. Laws, of course, do permit or prohibit certain things, but laws also educate us. So laws send a certain message about what is considered to be socially acceptable or even good, right? So it's very interesting to think about how abortion, which was originally justified under the slogan, safe, legal, and rare, right? Rare being emphasized, that nobody likes this, nobody thinks it's a good thing, but we're going to tolerate it because we want to prevent, the specter of back alley abortions and so on and so forth. And so we think that, even though this is a bad thing, we just want to make sure that it's safe. And so prevent, harm to women who were going to have abortion anyway. But what happened is that you get from safe, legal, and rare to abortion is a right, a fundamental human right, and is deemed as something almost positive and good, unapologetically argued for and defended, regardless of the reason, right? Even for mere convenience. And that's because laws do educate, right? When the law starts to proclaim something to be a right, we start to see it as a right from a moral perspective as well. And so laws in this regard are very distorting, and it's troubling to have laws that effectively say that a whole class of persons, right, the persons who are less than 9 months old, in a sense, right, that this whole class of persons just doesn't count, has no rights. And it's very similar to the ways in which laws permitting slavery educated people, miseducated people into thinking that Blacks simply were not the equal of whites, when of course we know that that is utterly false.
Another question concerns the discussion of maternal mortality rates vis-a-vis abortion rates and abortion legality. So could you say more about this, especially with regard to the relationship between a prior abortion and the possibility of an ectopic pregnancy?
Sure. So, I don't want to take too long, getting into details there, but several studies have been done that have indicated that the rate of ectopic pregnancy is several times higher for women who have had a prior abortion. And an ectopic pregnancy is a pregnancy typically when the embryo implants in the fallopian tube instead of the uterus, and those pregnancies are not viable. It's simply not possible for an unborn child to develop to term in the fallopian tube. And the risk is that effectively, if it goes unnoticed or untreated, and then there's a rupture in the fallopian tube, this could cause kind of massive hemorrhaging and lead, in some cases, even to the death of the mother. So this is one of the leading causes of maternal mortality, and increasing the risk for that then could be one reason why increases in abortion lead to lower or rather higher maternal mortality rates overall. I think the broader connection might also be that, as I was talking about before, when you think about pregnancy as a disease, which is what current abortion laws are teaching us, and it's a kind of distortion of the medical community and of the way that medical providers are taught to think about this. And so, instead of having so many resources go into training with regards to abortion, or in resources go into lobbying for legalization of abortion, if we use those resources to better promote maternal health, to get better training for doctors about more of the details of a woman's cycle and how to optimize that and how to prevent some easily preventable causes of miscarriage or of maternal health related problems, then we would likely see a reduction in maternal mortality. So I think it's also interesting to think about the opportunity cost of so many resources going to either abortion itself or to lobbying for abortion. Whereas I think people, regardless of which side of the debate you are on, should want to say that we want to provide women with at least real choices, right? And even Planned Parenthood's own statistics indicate that the vast majority of women who abort do so because they feel backed into a corner because they lack the emotional or financial or social support that they need. Whereas if they were given that support, and as many pro-lifers are trying to do with pregnancy resource centers and so on. But when they're given that support, most women no longer seek to abort. So that, I think, should be common ground for people on both sides of the debate.
Thank you so much. If we have time for maybe just one more question, one of our participants writes in that she was listening recently to a Catholic radio show that said there's a misconception that women who seek to have an abortion are not necessarily impoverished, and that there's been an increase in women who are considered economically stable who seek to have an abortion. This participant is wondering, how accurate is this? Has there been such an increase? Does social and economic status determine or influence perhaps who is most likely to seek an abortion?
Yeah, that's a complicated question, and I don't have the statistics kind of right at my fingertips right now. So I think it's probably true on the whole that people of lower socioeconomic status are still more likely to abort, because one of the primary reasons for abortion is feeling that one doesn't have the resources. But that doesn't mean that that's even the vast majority of abortions. Many abortions really do fall into that sort of abortion for convenience category, or just, I don't want to be a mother, or I just don't want to have another child, right? Women who are married and have children, but just don't want an additional child because it's not the right time, it's not the right spacing, professionally, it's not the right time, or single women who, have the resources to raise the child. And in our current culture, right, it's not a culture where women are going to be shamed or, stigmatized for giving birth out of wedlock, as it might have been, half a century ago, right? So single women who could very well at least give birth to the child, if not even raise the child, saying, well, abortion seems to be the easier way out, right? Which, again, as I've already talked about, is not really. And many of those women then go on to seriously regret the decision that they made.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Dr. Michela, for your time today and for this fantastic presentation.